Hello, everyone. I'm going to be taking a little bit of a detour today from the topics that we have been talking about because I recently was reading, just out of curiosity, I pulled an old book off the shelf and started reading more deeply into a controversy about a letter of Maimonides. And it occurred to me that what Maimonides was writing about, which is martyrdom and the question of martyrdom in Jewish history, and I'll explain more about why Maimonides was involved in this letter in a moment, is a subject that is worth talking about a little bit and exploring because it reminds us again how different the conditions are in the world today from what they were through most of Jewish history. And also when we speak about discrimination or anti-Semitism today, it's good to have some historical context and to understand what it is that our ancestors faced. So I'm going to not talk about martyrdom throughout Jewish history, in part because we couldn't possibly have enough time to discuss martyrdom throughout Jewish history, since sadly, martyrdom throughout Jewish history has been a long and a painful and an almost unending topic. I mean, even before the Shoah, even before the Holocaust, the history of Jewish persecutions through ancient and especially medieval times is close to unfathomable. As Abba Eben once wisely and wryly said, there are things in Jewish history too awful to be imagined, but nothing too awful not to have happened. So I can't really give you a resume of the history of Jewish martyrdom, but I do want to make one or two general remarks about the nature of martyrdom in Jewish law and history, and then examine this particular case of Maimonides' letter, just to familiarize you with it. The general choice of martyrdom, or the general fate of martyrdom, put better, falls into two categories: those that choose martyrdom and those that don't. That is, the most obvious and immediate example to us is someone who died in the Holocaust did not choose to go into the camp, did not choose to die, and yet, according to the Jewish tradition and Jewish law, they are martyrs. And to be a martyr means to die al kiddush Hashem, for the sanctification of God's name. And that term is going to be important, as you'll see. Now, the Jews died in the Holocaust did not choose to die al kiddush Hashem. It was done to them. And yet, for the tradition, they're considered to be martyrs. Other times, of course, one actually chooses to die. And this happened throughout the Middle Ages. In particular, the choice was often given to Jews to convert or die, and they would choose to die. In Jewish history, there are three things that you are supposed to die instead of doing: idolatry, adultery, and murder. Adultery is sort of broader. It's sexual crimes or sexual sins. If somebody puts a gun to your head and says, "I'll kill you if you don't kill this person," you're not supposed to kill that person. If someone says, "I'll kill you if you don't commit this sexual sin," if you don't commit incest, for example, you're not supposed to do it. If somebody says, "I'll kill you if you don't bow down to this idol," you're not supposed to do it. In time, this was broadened really to some extent to converting to another religion, which was considered a sort of species of idolatry, almost no matter which religion it was, although there you could have arguments. But many, many Jews, as you know, died instead of converting, for example, to Christianity, and many Jews died instead of converting to Islam. Those really were the two, especially Christianity, where forced conversions were not that rare. although sometimes they had a choice of something else during the Spanish Inquisition. For example, many fled. Now, fleeing could lead to death, but it wasn't an immediate choice for many. So this goes back to, as you know, at least Roman times, where rabbis were martyred al Kiddush Hashem, for the sanctification of God's name. And we read that story, Ela Ezkara, each year in the Yom Kippur service, where we talk about the martyrs of the Hadrianic persecutions, the time of Hadrian in the 130s CE. The question also goes back further in the time of the Maccabees, and before that, people died al Kiddush Hashem, for the sanctification of God's name. And generally today, those who die in the state of Israel, in the conflicts of the state of Israel, are considered to have died al Kiddush Hashem, for the sanctification of God's name. But without getting into Israel and the question of politics, let's go back to the Middle Ages. Maimonides himself was born in Spain. He lived 1135 to 1204. He was born in Spain. Now, some of you may have heard correctly that there was for a while something called the Golden Age of Spain, time in which, for example, Yehuda Halevi lived. And the Golden Age of Spain was under Muslim, not Christian rule. When Christians took over Spain in the Reconquista, that's what eventually led to the Inquisition. Christianity tended to be, throughout the Middle Ages, overall more hostile to Judaism than Islam was, for a variety of reasons, which we need not go into now. But when Maimonides was born in Spain, however, there was a particularly fanatic regime, Islamic regime, not only in Spain, but also, as we shall see, in Morocco and other places, called the Almohad. And the Almohad persecutions of Jews were serious and sustained. And that's why, although Maimonides was born in Spain, his family did not stay there. They went after to Morocco. To this day, if you go to Fez, you can find the house that Maimonides is said to have lived in, and you can buy all sorts of Maimonides memorabilia. And then he went on to Fostat, which was right outside the city of Cairo and is now incorporated in the city of Cairo, where he lived the rest of his life. But in 1165, when Maimonides was almost 30 years old, so he's in his late 20s, what happened was that in Morocco, in particular, the Almohads gave Jews a choice to convert or to die. And according to Jewish law, the proper, and I put proper in quotation marks, the proper thing to do is to die, is not to convert. This is complicated, however, by a couple of factors. One is that to convert to Islam is very easy. You need only say one sentence, and that basically completes your conversion. So Jews weren't being asked to bow down to idols. They weren't being asked to eat pork. They were being asked to say something. And yet, it is undeniable that that constituted, according to Islamic law, conversion to Islam. They were then going to be expected to live as Muslims. And so the question arose, what do you do? And this may not surprise you, many Jews converted. Some converted and practiced, many converted and practiced Judaism secretly, like the Marranos or the conversos, depending on the terminology you use and which time and which place, which is another question, in Spain. And so they continued to be Jews, but they professed as Muslims. a rabbi whose identity we don't know. One of those cases where his words have only been preserved by the person who argued against him. Invade against the converts in Morocco and said that they had violated Jewish law, that they were chayav mita, which means basically that they were subject to the death penalty, and that they ought to have been willing to die al kiddush Hashem. Because if you don't die al kiddush Hashem, for the sanctification of God's name, then, according to this rabbi and a considerable body of Jewish law, what you're doing is committing a chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name. The rabbi, from what we can tell, made a serious and starkly worded and considerably buttressed case with Jewish sources. And so the community turned to Maimonides, who, even though he was only in his late 20s and had not yet composed most of the works, although he composed one, most of the works for which he was to become not only world famous, but famous throughout history, famous to this day, they turned to him because he was already a considerable figure, a figure of considerable stature, and said, like, what is the status of people who have converted? Have they, in fact, committed a chilul Hashem? Have they desecrated God's name? And are they therefore liable to the death penalty? Now, one of the things that's important, Maimonides probably composed this in Morocco right before he left Fez. And it is important to remember that Maimonides was the greatest legal mind that Judaism has produced. So he's not going to give them an answer that has no halachic, no legal ramifications. And halachically, the case seems to be relatively clear. You are not supposed to convert. You're supposed to be willing to die rather than to convert, at least classically according to Jewish law. And many, many Jews did during the Crusades, for example, which was around the time of Maimonides and a little before Maimonides. Many Jews died al kiddush Hashem, for the sanctification of God's name. And many of them did so quite willingly. Some of them were killed, obviously, involuntarily. Some of them were killed quite willingly out of a refusal to convert. So I wanted to just tell you what Maimonides' response was and to say a few words about it. Now, you can read his response. I'm sure if you go on the internet and you look up Maimonides' epistle on martyrdom, Igeret Hashmad, the letter about martyrdom, you can find it easily and you can read it easily. And it's not very long. It's only a few pages. It's a letter, basically. It's not a book. In this printed version that I have in front of me, it starts on page, let's see, 15 and ends on page 30. So it's about 15 pages, about 16, 17 pages. The version, by the way, that I'm using is translated by Abraham Halkin and commented on by David Hartman, the inspiration for the Shalom Hartman Institute. David Hartman was a well-known rabbi, philosopher here and in Israel and in Canada, actually, originally. Anyway, this is what Maimonides says. First, he does something very unusual for Maimonides, which is he insults the author of the letter, because his project is going to be to discredit this guy. So he says, for example, he offered a weak and senseless reply of foul content and form. Now, these kinds of invectives, I have to say, Maimonides rarely talks that way. And when he does, he doesn't do it quite as well as some of the really, really rough rabbinic authorities. He's unused to insulting people, so he's not as good at that as he is at everything else. But he gives the gist of the other guy, and he starts off by making a distinction between people who convert voluntarily and people who are forced to convert. And he says that onus, compulsion, is the first thing that we should take into account here. Now, it is true that you can take this into account. It is also true, by the way, that most of the Jews throughout history who gave their lives rather than convert did so because they were being compelled. So it's not a clincher to say, well, if you're compelled, you don't have to do it, because obviously most Jews who converted throughout history did so out of compulsion. Then Maimonides goes on to talk about all the times that God got upset at Jewish leaders who criticized Israel. And like when Elijah criticizes Israel and God rebukes him. And in fact, that's part of the tradition of why Elijah comes to every Brit Milah, is he said, the people, God, are violating, are breaking your covenant. And God says, you think they're breaking my covenant? I want you there every time that they enact it. So the first thing that Maimonides says is that you should not indict the children of Israel. That's not the role of a leader, is to make these kinds of blanket statements about how bad they all are. Even in the Bible, God doesn't like that. He says, also in this persecution to which we're subjected, we don't pretend we are idolaters. We only appear to believe what they assert. They understand we don't mean it and are simply deceiving them to appease the ruler. The second thing Maimonides says is, everybody knows this is not a real conversion. You know it. They know it. When you say that sentence, I think it's called the Shahada, right? When you say the sentence that is the sentence that converts you to Islam, nobody who holds a sword to your neck thinks that you mean it when you say it. That is certainly also true. And then he uses it in a kind of inversion. He says, and if you do convert, then for every mitzvah you do, you should get extra credit, not less credit or no credit, as the rabbi apparently says in his letter. Because having done that, now you're really, taking your life into your hands by doing that when you have to do it secretly. And so surely God will credit you for that. And after all, the other possibility is, you could argue that Islam is not the same as idolatry. For Maimonides, by the way, Christianity was idolatry and Islam wasn't. Remember that Maimonides never lived in Christian lands. And as far as he was concerned, seeing a statue of Jesus made it idolatry, whereas Islam was very, very strictly monotheistic, the same way that Judaism was, and did not allow images to be worshipped in any way. So that doesn't mean, and Maimonides makes this clear, that profaning God's name isn't bad, that it isn't a chilul Hashem. Profanation of God's name is a grievous sin. So is sanctification of his name a meritorious deed, one which is generously rewarded. In other words, if you do decide to give your life rather than convert, you'll be generously rewarded for it, which he believes is true. So if he didn't surrender himself to death, but if you don't, if you choose not to, if you choose to maintain your life and give up your public profession of faith, but transgressed under duress and did not die, he did not act properly, and under compulsion he profaned God's name. However, he is not to be punished. So why does Maimonides say this? Because as you can hear, it's not easy for him. But if anyone comes to ask me whether to surrender his life or acknowledge, I'll tell him to confess and not choose death. In other words, he would advise them, even though it is proper legally to choose death, and as a halachist, he would have to say, you have to choose death. As a community leader, he says, confess and don't choose death. However, he should not continue to live in the domain of that ruler. He should stay home and not go out. And if he's dependent on work, let him be the Jew in private. And when our rabbis ruled that a person is to surrender himself to death and not transgress, in other words, when the Jewish law says that you're supposed to die and not transgress, it doesn't seem likely that they had in mind speech that didn't involve action. So he's making a distinction here. If they force you to take action, that's a different story. If it's just about the speech, then I would say maybe you can get away with it and not die. But what you have to do is leave that jurisdiction as soon as possible, which is what Maimonides and his family did, right? They left Fez and went to Cairo, where, by the way, they were still under an Islamic regime, but a much more tolerant Islamic regime. And then he talks to the rabbi, well, to the people, but to the rabbi who issued the edict that people were terrible if they didn't die. It is not right to alienate, scorn, and hate people who desecrate the Sabbath. It is our duty to befriend them and encourage them to fulfill the commandments. The rabbis regulate explicitly when an evildoer sinned by choice comes to the synagogue, he's to be welcomed and not insulted. And then he goes on to say, I hope that the day will come when these persecutions will cease. Why do I bring all this up? I bring this up in part because you see that Maimonides, the legal scholar, and Maimonides, the community leader, were not always of the same mind. In fact, there is a really interesting debate about this Igeret Hashmad between Chaim Soloveitchik and a number of scholars, including Hartman. Soloveitchik says basically that Maimonides' legal arguments are weak and almost insupportable, and that Maimonides was aware that he wasn't making sound legal arguments, whereas others disagree and say, no, actually his legal arguments are sound and supportable, or at least he thought they were. But it seems pretty clear that Maimonides wants to ensure the survival and the integrity of the community at a time of terrible persecutions. And the purpose of learning about this, apart from its intrinsic interest, is that this question has been bandied about quite a bit. It was even during the time of the Shoah, there were questions about whether one could convert, how one should act. There is a book of Tshuvot, a book of legal response called Min HaMa'amakim by a rabbi named Oshri, that enshrines all sorts of questions like this and other similar questions. Guy asked, did he convert in Fez? There were rumblings at the end of Maimonides' life by some of his detractors that he had in fact converted in Fez. We have no sure evidence either way. As you said, his biographer, Martin Kramer, thinks so. Some of his biographers think that he might have, others deny it. There isn't any proof either way, so we don't know. Maimonides himself never says he did, and no one, it seems like nobody with firsthand knowledge of it says he did. So I really can't answer that question with certainty, but I suspect that part of the reason why that rumor got started is because people felt like he was writing this letter out of self-justification as well as to help the rest of the community. And there is no, we don't have an eyewitness, so we don't know. But I do think that the more sort of compelling story here is the story of somebody who is required to do things in order to sustain a community that are in at least apparent violation of the principles that he would otherwise uphold. And this is what such persecutions have forced among Jews for a long time. And what happens, of course, in time is if the Jewish community lives in that place long enough, eventually they forget the reality of their own tradition. And so in every Jewish persecution, you have this sort of tripartite split between those who convert those who do not convert and manage somehow to make it through and escape, and those who do not convert and die as a result of it. And for a community leader, it is not an easy decision in the Middle Ages. Today, of course, it would be a much easier decision. I think the vast majority of people would say that one shouldn't die. But recognize that we don't feel that way about everything, right? I mean, we send people to die all the time in military conflicts abroad. And certainly, I think, would do that if there were a military conflict at home, right? If a nation invaded the United States, people would willingly die to preserve their nation and their country. And so it shouldn't seem strange to us that Jews throughout the ages have been willing to die to preserve Judaism, which for them was a greater cause, which for us, I should say, is a greater cause than any nation could be, because it's upholding the word of God. And so this is not an easy call for any halachist to make. And I just wanted to bring to you because we talk so much about contemporary issues and contemporary Judaism, I wanted to just reintroduce some of the severities of Jewish history and some of the pain of Jewish history, so that it should become part of the mental furniture that we use to think about our tradition and what it means, and the way in which it has been shaped by this sort of relentless pressure on Jews to adhere to their tradition or abandon their tradition, and suffer as a result. So, okay, are there any, let me stop for a minute and ask any questions. So far, I don't have any questions except for Guy's question about whether Maimonides himself converted. Are there any other questions that you want to ask? If not, then I will just wrap up and tell you that next time we'll return to a contemporary issue. We'll see which one. I have a couple of ideas. If you have one in particular that you want me to talk about, just let me know. But for now, I do urge you to take a look if you are interested. Just check on the internet and you can find Maimonides' Epistle on Martyrdom, and the way in which this greatest of Jewish scholars tries to, without letting go of his deep commitment to the halachic system, to the Jewish legal system and the demands that it makes, which are sometimes pretty stringent, the way in which he tries to give comfort and support to the community of Fez that faced this horrible persecution. And with that, I want to thank you for joining us today for the Lainer Learning and Lunch, and hope to see you next time, and hope I will see you on Thursday morning here at 9 o'clock Pacific time for Torah study on Thursdays. Bye.